Section 31 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5 by Henry Gray. The urinary bladder. Vesica urinaria, bladder. The urinary bladder is a muscular membranous sac which acts as a reservoir for the urine, and as its size, position, and relations vary according to the amount of fluid it contains, it is necessary to study it as it appears A. when empty, and B. when distended. In both conditions, the position of the bladder varies with the condition of the rectum, being pushed upward and forward when the rectum is distended. The empty bladder. When hardened in situ, the empty bladder has the form of a flattened tetrahedron with its vertex tilted forward. It presents a fundus, a vertex, a superior and an inferior surface. The fundus is triangular in shape and is directed downward and backward toward the rectum, from which it is separated by the rectovesical fascia, the vesiculae seminales, and the terminal portions of the ductus deferentes. The vertex is directed forward toward the upper part of the symphysis pubis, and from it the middle umbilical ligament is continued upward on the back of the anterior abdominal wall to the umbilicus. The peritoneum is carried by it from the vertex of the bladder on to the abdominal wall to form the middle umbilical fold. The superior surface is triangular, bounded on either side by a lateral border which separates it from the inferior surface, and behind by a posterior border, represented by a line joining the two ureters, which intervenes between it and the fundus. The lateral borders extend from the ureters to the vertex, and from them the peritoneum is carried to the walls of the pelvis. On either side of the bladder, the peritoneum shows a depression, named the paravesical fossa. The superior surface is directed upward, is covered by peritoneum, and is in relation with the sigmoid colon and some of the coils of the small intestine. When the bladder is empty and firmly contracted, this surface is convex and the lateral and posterior borders are rounded, whereas if the bladder be relaxed it is concave, and the interior of the viscus, as seen in a median sagittal section, presents the appearance of a V-shaped slit with a shorter posterior and a longer anterior limb, the apex of the V corresponding with the internal orifice of the urethra. The inferior surface is directed downward and is uncovered by peritoneum. It may be divided into a posterior or prostatic area and two inferolateral surfaces. The prostatic area is somewhat triangular. It rests upon and is in direct continuity with the base of the prostate, and from it the urethra emerges. The inferolateral portions of the inferior surface are directed downward and lateralward. In front, they are separated from the symphysis pubis by a mass of fatty tissue, which is named the retropubic pad. Behind, they are in contact with the fascia, which covers the levatores ani and obturatores interni. When the bladder is empty, it is placed entirely within the pelvis, below the level of the obliterated hypogastric arteries, and below the level of those portions of the ductus deferentes which are in contact with the lateral wall of the pelvis. After they cross the ureters, the ductus deferentes come into contact with the fundus of the bladder. As the viscus fills, its fundus, being more or less fixed, is only slightly depressed, while its superior surface gradually rises into the abdominal cavity, carrying with it its peritoneal covering, and at the same time rounding off the posterior and lateral borders. The distended bladder. When the bladder is moderately full, it contains about 0.5 litres and assumes an oval form. The long diameter of the oval measures about 12 centimetres and is directed upward and forward. In this condition it presents a postero-superior, an antero-inferior, and two lateral surfaces, a fundus and a summit. The postero-superior surface is directed upward and backward and is covered by peritoneum. Behind, it is separated from the rectum by the rectovesical excavation, while its anterior part is in contact with the coils of the small intestine. The antero-inferior surface is devoid of peritoneum and rests below, against the pubic bones, above which it is in contact with the back of the anterior abdominal wall. The lower parts of the lateral surfaces are destitute of peritoneum and are in contact with the lateral walls of the pelvis. The line of peritoneal reflection from the lateral surface is raised to the level of the obliterated hypogastric artery. The fundus undergoes little alteration in position, being only slightly lowered. It exhibits, however, a narrow triangular area, which is separated from the rectum merely by the rectovesical fascia. This area is bounded below by the prostate, above by the rectovesical fold of peritoneum, and laterally by the ductus deferens. The ductus deferens frequently come into contact with each other above the prostate, and under such circumstances the lower part of the triangular area is obliterated. The line of reflection of the peritoneum from the rectum to the bladder appears to undergo little or no change when the latter is distended. It is situated about 10 cm from the anus. The summit is directed upward and forward above the point of attachment of the middle umbilical ligament, and hence the peritoneum which follows the ligament forms a pouch of varying depth between the summit of the bladder and the anterior abdominal wall. The bladder in the child. In the newborn child, the internal urethral orifice is at the level of the upper border of the symphysis pubis. The bladder, therefore, lies relatively at a much higher level in the infant than in the adult. Its anterior surface is in contact with about the lower 2/3 of that part of the abdominal wall which lies between the symphysis pubis and the umbilicus. Symington. Its fundus is clothed with peritoneum as far as the level of the internal orifice of the urethra. Although the bladder of the infant is usually described as an abdominal organ, Symington has pointed out that only about 1/2 of it lies above the plane of the superior aperture of the pelvis. Dis maintains that the internal urethral orifice sinks rapidly during the first years, and then more slowly until the 9th year, after which it remains stationary until puberty, when it again slowly descends and reaches its adult position. The female bladder. In the female, the bladder is in relation behind with the uterus and the upper part of the vagina. It is separated from the anterior surface of the body of the uterus by the vesicuterine excavation, but below the level of this excavation it is connected to the front of the cervix uteri, and the upper part of the anterior wall of the vagina by areolar tissue. When the bladder is empty, the uterus rests upon its superior surface. The female bladder is said by some to be more capacious than that of the male, but probably the opposite is the case. Ligaments. The bladder is connected to the pelvic wall by the fascia endopelvina. In front, this fascial attachment is strengthened by a few muscular fibres, the pubovesicales, which extend from the back of the pubic bones to the front of the bladder. Behind, other muscular fibres run from the fundus of the bladder to the sides of the rectum in the sacrogenital folds and constitute the rectovesicales. The vertex of the bladder is joined to the umbilicus by the remains of the urachus, which forms the middle umbilical ligament, a fibromuscular cord, broad at its attachment to the bladder, but narrowing as it ascends. From the superior surface of the bladder, the peritoneum is carried off in a series of folds, which are sometimes termed the false ligaments of the bladder. Anteriorly, there are 3 folds, the middle umbilical fold on the middle umbilical ligament, and 2 lateral umbilical folds on the obliterated hypogastric arteries. The reflections of the peritoneum onto the side walls of the pelvis form the lateral false ligaments, while the sacrogenital folds constitute posterior false ligaments. Interior of the bladder. The mucous membrane lining the bladder is, over the greater part of the viscus, loosely attached to the muscular